So we are going to resume the morning session with the second paper. The second paper has been prepared by Papadia, Ritschl, and Sarferaz, but it seems to me that only Papadia will present it. Am I right? Okay. And it consists in a highly sophisticated reconstruction of the business cycle 1861-1914. The authors use a multiplicity of theories normally not employed in business cycle studies, following Stefano's recommendation of disaggregating, having a wealth of data. So please, Andrea Papadia, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Let me share the screen. Okay. Yes, so this, as mentioned, this is joint work with Albrecht Ritschl and Samad Sarfaraz. And I should say that, Stefano was my undergrad teacher in economic history in Rome. So, this paper very, very directly influenced to him, even though I don't know how much he would actually approve of the methodology we use here, but definitely the inspiration is there.
Okay.
So let me talk a little bit. So yeah, we look at the business cycle in the liberal age in Italy, and I would argue that thanks to the work of Fenoaltea, of course, but also Fiji and many others, in fact, we now have like a pretty good picture of the growth of the Italian economy in this age, especially the trend growth. I would argue that the business cycle dynamics are maybe a little bit more controversial or unclear. For example, if we look at the latest reconstruction of the GDP produced by Fenoaltea in his latest book and compare it to Fenoaltea's earlier work or to Bafiji's series, we can see that the business cycle dynamics are quite different. And I would argue that, apart from the interest that we all have for the Italian economy in this period, a reliable quantitative basic, including business cycle dynamics, is important to understand the many, many interesting things that happen in Italy in this period. The process of unification and the growing industrialization of the country, but also things like mass immigration, globalization, or what Paolo was talking about in the earlier presentation, the Italy's relationship with the rest of the world. So what we do is to use a different methodology to classical historical national accounts reconstruction to try and measure the business cycle dynamics in Italy. So what we do is to start with as large panel as we can, basically, of disaggregated time series, and then we condense them or aggregate them into one common cyclical component, using this dynamic factor analysis, and we allow for the factor loadings, which you can think about as index weights of that relate to the individual series to the overall factor or the overall business cycle. We allow this to vary over time in a dynamic way to account for structural change. And the estimation method that we do, this is Bayesian, this part is not very interesting, so I'm not going to spend too much time on the technicalities. So we have two samples. One goes from 1863 to 1913, and the other one from 1883 to 1913. And the reason is that we have more series starting from the 1880s, so we wanted to also check how our estimation changes if we have this additional data in the overall estimation. And then for each subperiod, we estimate 3 different factors: one for overall, so all the series, and then 2 for sectors of the economy, agriculture, and the industrial sector. And we could do more. We could subdivide the sample into different things that according to what we want to look at. For example, you could look at a financial cycle, but we haven't done that yet. So why do we need to complement historical national accounts, or why do we think it's nice to do that? And I say complement, absolutely not substitute, because I think our methodology does something slightly different from what historical national accounting does. And I think we think it's particularly useful when you have the underlying data is imperfect, and we know, of course, from Stefano's work and those of others that the data in this period is highly imperfect. We have scarcity of business census data. And we also have things like, the Italian economy is developing in uneven ways across sectors, across regions. So all these things pose challenges for how to aggregate the disaggregated data that we have. And this methodology offers a different way to aggregate, which is not through sector weights, but through the cove movement of all this series. And my co-authors have used this methodology before to recover business cycle facts for the US over the long run, and for Germany in the pre-World War period, and have shown that this methodology works well in this kind of context where the underlying data is problematic. We also want to offer a broader view of the business cycle, because as Vera mentioned, we can use series that would not normally be used in historical national accounting. So what we see as the business cycle is not only fluctuations, just GDP around the trend, but a co-movement of a very large array of economic indicators. And this was also the idea that was in the pioneers of business cycle research, such as Burns and Mitchell, but also later contribution by people like Lucas or Stock and Watson. And yeah, there is a connection. As I said before, I don't know how much Stefano would approve of our methodology, but we see connections to what his regole dell'arte that he laid out in the 2020 book, disaggregate, yes, but also rule 3 and 4, which have to do with how you aggregate the data and how you get from data to value added, and our methodology offers a different way to aggregate, which we think overcomes some of the problems that normally would have. But also, we think rule number 5, as I just mentioned, we want to measure business cycle in a broad sense. So we want to really have this as much as economic information coming from this series, which would not normally be used in historical national account. So I will briefly now talk about the existing literature, because of course this guided our research, then data methodology and results. So I would argue that there's 2 main strands of literature that our paper talks to. One is the one of GDP reconstructions, and again, there's Fenoaltea's work and early work by Baffigi and Fenoaltea himself. And then there's studies specifically on the business cycle, either in the long run, covering also the liberal age, or specifically in the liberal age. And there is here work, by Fenoaltea joint with Ciccarelli, Baffigi and co-authors, Marchionati and Sella, and Gallegati, and Clementi, Gallegati, and Gallegati, who, all these studies apply a variety of econometrics techniques to kind of extract the cyclical component from the overall evolution of the economy, usually GDP series. And, there's a partial exception to what I'm going to say next is the Marchionati and Sella method, which show that if you use very different filtering techniques, you can get very different business cycle dynamics. But most of these studies kind of find that the main determinant of business cycle dynamics is not necessarily the econometric technique they use to distinguish cycle and trend, but the underlying series they're using, the underlying GDP series. So what we do again is different, because we start from the disaggregated data. So here is the cyclical component of the 3 GDP reconstructions that I just mentioned. And here we obtain it with the Hodrick-Prescott filter, but we tried other filters and the dynamics look really, really similar. So in this context, the filtering technique again doesn't seem to be the key, unless of course you use very different techniques. So here you can see that the latest Fenoaltea series and the earlier work, they move pretty closely together up until about 1890, where the series started to diverge, both in terms a little bit of turning points, but especially in terms of the volatility of the economy. And the reason is that the latest reconstruction by Fenoaltea makes adjustments for the agriculture sector compared to early work, which relied on the agriculture series constructed by Federico in 2003. Whereas Fenoaltea work takes this series and then allows for more fluctuations due to what was happening in the harvest, thanks to going back to the original Easted series and taking the annual fluctuations from those, and obtaining a much more volatile economy also after 1890. And you can see this here. So this is the difference in the volatility before and after 1890. In the latest reconstruction by Fenoaltea, it goes down by 9%, whereas in previous work, it went down by 36 to 43%. And by volatility here, it's very, very simply measured with the standard deviation of the cyclical components. So, and I should say that, most of, just to, as I mentioned before, agriculture really is the key, but agriculture is the key to the overall business cycle in this period. Unsurprisingly, given that Italy is very much still an agrarian country, and the fact that there are these fluctuations due to changes in the harvest from year to year. So this explains why agriculture is so dominant in the business cycle, and you can see this here. This is instead the cyclical component of industrial value added, and you can see that the three series are almost identical here. And if you look at the correlation between the agriculture sector, industry, and the overall business cycle, you can see that again, agriculture is really dominant here. Industry is playing a relatively minor role. So let me come to what we do. So we have two data sets, as I mentioned before. The one from 1863 to 1913 has 212 time series, and I should say that this is a pretty large or very large statistical basis for this type of exercise, even compared to the work that my co-authors did in the past. And again, this is thanks to the work of Stefano and many others. So here's the background. We have an agriculture series, industrial series, series related to trade, money and finance, demographics, and what I call justice and social series that I'll explain a little bit later. For 1883 to 1913, we have more series, as I mentioned, and the sources that we use are ISTAT, so the disaggregated the series provided by ISTAT. For the industrial sector, we mostly rely on Ciccarelli and Fenoaltea, and then for the financial series, we mostly rely on De Bonis et al. And Francese and Pace. And here are some examples. It's a very ugly slide, but here are some examples of the series that we have in our data sets. And I should say, for agriculture industry, we rely entirely on physical production. So we don't have, value added or things like that. So we're looking at physical production. And for agriculture, things like wheat, wine, citrus fruits, olive oil, and so on and so forth. Industry covers manufacturing, extractive and non-manufacturing industries. Trade relates to exports, imports from specific continents or specific goods, as well as the movements of the merchant fleet. The cabotage trade, so the internal trade, the tonnage of goods that are loaded or unloaded in ports. Money and finance, we have series on prices, numbers of credit institutions, bank loans, notes and coins in circulation, interest rates. Demographics, we have things like infant and general mortality, births, how the population is changing, things like height at birth, which also might be indicators of economic conditions. And in terms of justice and social, we have things like numbers of marriages, how many pupils are enrolled in primary and secondary educations, and legal proceedings in courts. And actually, the main difference between the two data sets is the justice series, which are much more abundant in the later data sets. And we also have things in there that we think are very informative for the business cycle, like the number of bankruptcies and other legal proceedings, which are connected with the dissolution of companies, and also property crimes. And there is a literature that shows that these series are indeed very correlated with economic conditions. So I'm going to be very quick on the methodology because it's just a lot of equations and it's not very interesting. But as I mentioned before, the intuition is very simple, actually. We want to extract a common component from a large number of time series, and we replace the aggregation. So we aggregate this series. Instead of through index weights, which would be normally the way to do it, we use cross-sectional correlation. And this builds on the work of many people like Sargent and Sims, Gaveke, and Stock and Watson, and so on. So this is basically, the equation one is the main equation. So you have each series Y, and it's related to F, which is the factor that we estimate, this component that we interpret as the business cycle, through this lambda here, which is the factor loadings, which essentially can be thought of as index weights in our context, and these are allowed to vary over time. So that's how we account for structural change. I'm going to skip the rest of this, and I'm going to get to the results. Okay, so this is the two factors that we estimate for the overall economy for 1863 to 1913 and from 1883 to 1913. And as you can see, the factors could move quite a lot, especially in the early part. But then after 1890, which again seems to be a pretty important date for changes in the Italian economy, you can see that the shorter factor seems to be more volatile than the other one. And again, this, the main difference between the two are this justice series, and we wonder, we have to do more work to look into this, what role they play, and whether they're capturing something about the economy and economic conditions that might not be captured in the other series, about the depth of crisis years, or how big the boom years are. So we think this is interesting. What happens when we compare our factor to GDP reconstruction, or the cyclical component of GDP reconstruction? Here we're comparing to the Fenoaltea series, which is the solid black line, and then we have the factors again in blue and in red. And you can see that actually our factor co-moves pretty well with the Fenoaltea cyclical component GDP series. There are some exceptions though. One is the 1860s. So we can see that in the 1860s, actually the two series kind of look like mirror images of each other. So the turning points are the opposite, booms and busts. We're not yet sure why, so we have to look into this to understand this better. But then you can see that thereafter there is most of the turning points tend to correspond. So when there's a boom in our series, there's a boom in the Fenoaltea series, and so on. This story is quite different when we compare our factor to early GDP reconstruction. Again, these early GDP reconstructions don't have the adjustment for the cyclical component of agriculture, which explains a lot of the differences that, whereas the latest Fenoaltea series does. And you can see that actually the correspondence between our factor and, for example, Bafiji's GDP reconstruction is pretty low. And the same is true for Fenoaltea's earlier work. You can actually look at the correlation between the series. You can see that our series corresponds pretty well with the Fenoaltea series, even though the correlation is not super high, because we have the differences, for example, especially in the earlier part of the sample, but the correlation really is pretty low or even negative with the other GDP reconstructions. For the shorter factor, we actually find a better correspondence with the Bafiji series. So we also need to look a little bit more into that to understand why it's exactly the case. One interesting thing, though, that we find is that, I mentioned before that this decrease in volatility after 1890 is characteristic of earlier GDP reconstructions compared to the Fenoaltea one, the latest Fenoaltea one. But actually, when we look at our factor, we see a similar decrease in volatility after 1892 to this GDP reconstruction, about 40%. The interesting thing is that we cannot, quote unquote, blame the Federico agricultural series for this, for being too little volatile, because we use the original ISTA to disaggregated data for agriculture. So, the reasons why we find this drop in volatility, we still need to look into them, but we think it's very interesting that we're kind of going back in this particular sense to earlier GDP reconstructions. So this is just a summary of what I just said, so I'm gonna skip that. And I'm not gonna show you the agriculture factors for a couple of reasons. One is that essentially the story for the agriculture factor is very similar to the one for the overall factor. As I mentioned before, agriculture really is driving the whole business cycle, even in our case. So what I'm gonna show you here is the industrial factor. So this is our factor using just the industrial series compared to the cyclical component of value added in industry from Fenoaltea. And you can see that, again, there are a lot of similarities, especially here now in the 1860s, the two look quite similar in the 1870s. But we see again that the two series diverge, and this happens basically after 1895. So again, there seems to be something that going forward in the Italian economy after the 1890s or the beginning of the 20th century, things start to change, and our measures of economic activity seems to start diverging a little bit more. And again, this is something that we need to understand much better. But overall, there's a pretty good correspondence, and this is not surprising, given that essentially here the statistical basis of our index and the Fenoaltea one are essentially the same. So again, this is a summary of what I just said. Let me come to the conclusion. So I think our exercise confirms that this other methodology can be useful in recovering business cycle dynamics, started from disaggregated data when the underlying data is imperfect. And our estimated factors are closest to Fenoaltea's latest GDP reconstructions. And again, this is not surprising, given that, you know, we especially like our series take into account the agriculture fluctuations that are contained in the original ISTAT series. However, there's also important differences which we need to do much more work to understand better. For example, what happens in the 1860s and what happens in terms of volatility post 1890. Again, the agriculture sector is probably going to be key here to understand, but we also see that the industrial sector has a decrease in volatility and a divergence between our series and other work in the first decade of the 20th century. So we need to understand also a little bit better what role the industrial sector plays. In terms of further analysis, one thing that we definitely want to do and we're going to do is look at the factor loading. So basically the weight that we give to each series in terms of creating the overall aggregate measure of economic activity, because this is really important to understand what is driving exactly our results. So we need to do a very systematic analysis of the factor loadings, and that's what we're going to do in the near future. And then the other thing that we can do again is to disaggregate the economy more, maybe look at the financial sector. And we're also interested, connected to what Paolo was saying before as well, to look at the influence of, for example, capital imports in driving the business cycle. We've done some preliminary work on this, but it's very preliminary. So hopefully in the next iteration of the paper, we'll have that. So thank you very much. It's been really an honor to be part of this event, and I look forward to your comments. You're muted.
I raised my hand, so can I make some questions? Vera, you are muted. We cannot hear you, Vera.
Yes, yes, I'd closed down. I'm very sorry. Alessandro and Alberto want to intervene, and also
I think
Paolo.
Alberto was first, so I will.
It's okay, Alessandro, go on. I can, okay.
Or my clarification question, so maybe I can do it quickly. So the series, the original series, or all these series, do you filter them before starting the process or not? Because this would be just a very quick clarification point.
Yes, we'll filter them all.
Okay, then I shut up here.
Yes, I may add a point on this, because introducing the value added reconstructions for industry, we had to correct some of the disaggregated data, because they were partial or biased for many reasons. So using the original ISTAT disaggregated data might not be coherent with the value added produced.
But this was for industry, you mentioned.
Yes, for industry.
So
yes,
for industry, for industry, we don't use we use only a couple of series from ISTAT, but we mainly use the Ciccarelli and Fenoaltea regional series. We aggregate them up at the national level, and then we use those.
Oh, okay. No, because otherwise there's a problem. Yeah. And Alessandro asked the question. Please.
About the filter. If you filter the series before estimating the dynamic factor model.
Yes.
Are they filtered? Yeah, they're filtered without the Prescott filter and so on.
Yes, we want to also try different filtering techniques.
Okay, that's fine.
Yeah.
That's fine.
Okay, Alberto.
Okay, thank you. I found this paper very interesting because I think it's important to have a broader view of the business cycle. The debates until now have been concerning mostly the GDP dynamics, and so to put more data in the analysis is important. I think that unfortunately in the first 20-25 years or so, data are not so good, and that's why I think you find some problems, some contrasting results between the different reconstructions and with your factor. And then I have a point and a question about agriculture. You found that agriculture is very dominant, which is not new. It's not new because agriculture was very big, we know. But this is a problem. There is a problem because we know that, and also Stefano told us, we know that agriculture is the weakest sector as far as data reconstruction is concerned. It's very weak. We have some progress in the last estimate by Stefano. He tried to get some progress. Maybe it would be more correct. And so I wonder if you try to do an exercise excluding totally agriculture, in order to see what happens to your factor analysis. So basically, in order to have results only about industry, also maybe separating services and from industry. So this is the main point. So agriculture and so separating the different sectors. And another, maybe a minor point, but I don't know if it's minor. It would be interesting to make an analysis of the innovation which Stefano introduced in 2020. We know that there are some important innovations in his estimates. So maybe it could be nice to exclude, to go back to the old theories and to make a comparison between the two, trying to understand what is the weight of these innovations introduced by Stefano in 2020. Thank you. Very interesting paper.
Someone else who wants to intervene?
I think Paolo.
Yes, Paolo. Yes. Go ahead, Paolo. And then Andrea will comment.
Andrea, can you hear me? Because I always have this technical problem.
Yes,
okay, thank you very much. It's very, very interesting paper. I liked it. I just have some comments on the use of this justice and legal series. As you know, I have a passion for bankruptcy, which says it all. It's great that you include them. I can see some problems, however. I'm not sure how much weight they have in your series. Probably it's minimal. But if you look at bankruptcies are the actual formal bankruptcy takes place a long time after the economic problem. So it takes at least 2-3 years before this is formalized. So that might create a bit of a bias in that. Also, official bankruptcies were used very little in Italy, as Michelangelo and I argued in the Economic History Review a few years back, which might, if you give a bit of weight to these legal procedures, what might happen is that you smooth a bit the fluctuations, because they actually hide a lot of problems. Bankruptcies, but insolvency was dealt with mainly through informal procedures, devices, and so on. I don't know the other legal procedures, but I suspect that if the quality of the legal system is not very high, this might happen for all of it. So again, that might reduce a bit your volatility to an extent.
Okay, so Andrea, you can comment.
No, thanks. All great comments. So no, regarding Alberto's point, I agree. The agriculture series we know are the most problematic. So yeah, this is something that we've been thinking about. We'll definitely do more kind of sectoral factors, and one maybe just agriculture versus non-agriculture sector. Yeah, I don't know if we have enough on services, because it's mostly financial services that we can capture. So I don't know if we can do a service factor, but we might try to do that. And yes, the idea of looking at kind of the marginal impact of Stefano's latest work, I think that's also something that was floating in our heads. So we're definitely going to try to do that. And yes, thanks, Paolo, about the comments about the Justice and Legal series. That's very interesting. We need to we need to think about how to deal with that. We have to look at how much weight they actually have, which is this factor loadings analysis that I was mentioning before that we need to do in a systematic way. But yeah, as you can see, like all of the justice series already start like a little bit later, and I think this is 100% connected with what you were saying about the quality of the justice system. But yeah, we have to think a little bit more how to deal with this. We don't want to throw them away because we do think they contain some useful information, but we have to think a little bit more how to deal with the issues that you raised.
Just a final comment on services, because Paolo mentioned the services. Yes. And there are services that are measurable, like transportation, for instance.
Yeah.
You could use this, and of course financial services, but there are other services that are terribly difficult to measure, like personal services, professional services, housewives, services, and so on and so forth. So services is a major problem, and indeed when Fenoaltea came back on the estimation of services that I did together with two pupils of mine, he used indirect measures, to say that certain of our estimates could not be right, but he did not try to measure them directly, because it's a major problem, in fact. Okay, but I don't think that we can discuss the issue now. And thank you very much, Andrea Papadia. I think you are doing a very great work with your colleagues, and so go ahead, because you will discover more things. By disaggregation, I totally agree with Fenoaltea. One discovers a lot of things that instead by aggregation that remain distant. Thank you very much. And so we move to our third paper, which is a paper by Iodice that focuses on transaction costs in the maritime trade following the arrival in the Mediterranean of Northern European ships in the period between 1590 to 1616. Now, transaction cost is another theme researched by Stefano. And in this case, is very relevant because it was most probably, as the authors say, the successful invasion of the Mediterranean by Dutch and English navigators, the most important cause of their enrichment rather than the Atlantic business. So I think this is a very good topic. Who is going to present it?
Hello, I'm going to present the first part, and then I leave the floor to Luigi for the second part.
Okay, perfect. So go ahead.
Okay, thank you. I'm about to share my screen. You should be able to see my screen now. Okay. Our paper, as Professor Zamagni said, is a tribute to Stefano Fenoaltea's quantitative works on transaction costs in the early modern period Italian economy. He studied, as you know, risk management and transaction costs linked to medieval agriculture, while we analyzed the impact of transaction costs related to the sea risk in maritime trade competition in the Mediterranean Sea, following the arrival of Northern European shipmasters. We address in quantitative terms the role of transaction costs in northern vessels' operativity versus their Mediterranean competitors, by elaborating data from an underexploited risk-sharing institution, which is the General Average, GA. Our observation point is the capital of a small Italian Republican regional state, Genoa, based on the assumption that the sudden arrival of northern ships in the Mediterranean during the last decade of the 16th century acted as a structural shock on the seaboard trade, a structural vector autoregression model, SVR, is an appropriate tool to describe and interpret the northern invasion phenomenon, as Luigi will show you in the second part of this presentation. As I said, in this first part, I will focus on the main features of the northern invasion, on the role that the port of Genoa played in the European economy during this period, and finally on GA procedures seen as a type of transaction cost. Widely studied in the European literature, the process known as northern invasion started in the last decade of the 16th century and was facilitated by the absence of an hegemonic power capable of claiming the Mediterranean Sea. While scholars generally agree on the beginning of this phenomenon, there is not a specific ending, since northern merchant navies kept operating into the Mediterranean Sea during the following decades. By 1602, a second wave occurred, for example, thus making the northern invasion a longer-run phenomenon. We choose our sample period, therefore, based on the significance of and the availability of our primary evidences. According to the French historian Svr Model, initially the northern invasion theory asserted that the Dutch, English, and French merchant navies swarmed into the Mediterranean and rapidly seized control of the sea's commercial, financial, and maritime life thanks to their superior sailing ships. No one argues anymore that the Northerners' arrival led inevitably and relatively quickly to their preeminence in Mediterranean maritime trade. The situation was much more complex than this. Plus, it is true that Northerners had little impact on cabotage shipping structures, i.e. short and medium distance maritime trade. But their arrival had important repercussions, particularly on long distance maritime trade, which they quickly came to dominate. According to Richard Rapp, for example, it was the Mediterranean invasion by northern merchant navies, as also Professor Zamagni said, and not the exploitation of the Atlantic that at first fostered the golden ages of Dutch and English states. Scholars explain this phenomenon referring to the well-known structural factors related to hull design, such as the greater tonnage or low freight rates and heavier weaponry of northern vessels, or other exogenous factors, such as state policies. For example, Dutch shipbuilders supported several productivity-boosting innovations in ship manufacture. The construction cost of Dutch ships in Dutch shipyards was commonly reckoned to be 40 to 50% lower than in England in the middle of the 17th century. However, no revolution occurred in ships technology. It was a period of steady development rather than of revolutionary innovations. These factors allowed northern shipmasters to ask for lower freights. For example, the freight for a bale of cloth from Genoa to Palermo in 1619 on a large Dutch vessel was less than half that the one paid to a Mediterranean fregata or felucca, typical Mediterranean ships. However, information on freights are scarcely reported in the sources, therefore it is hard to quantitatively elaborate them. Data from GA sources, in this sense, will be a reliable proxy of transaction costs as alternative to freights. Genoa, as I said, will be a vantage observation point to study the northern invasion phenomenon for several reasons. Genoese merchant marine experienced a decline in the second half of the 16th century. The state did not put much effort on a stronger merchant navy, as instead did the main European monarchies. This favored commercial networks with foreign merchants and foreign navies. Small states usually did not have the political and military power to control maritime routes. That is why Genoa adopted neutrality policies that allowed the development of an international hub. The role of the port as a neutral emporium, although the Republic was formally an ally of the Spanish Empire, should allow to observe the presence of vessels of different nationalities that operated in a competitive market. Vessels arrive from all over Europe and beyond. Edoardo Grandi, a Genoese historian, published several studies on the arrival of vessels in Genoa in these years based on tax registers, in which he recalled the high number of northern vessels and the importance of trade headed to Genoa in this period. Mediterranean famines between 1590 and 1592 also prompted Genoa to attract vessels loaded with cereals from all northern Europe through an exceptional measure, the free port. All these elements make the port of Genoa a significant observation point for the impact of GA-related transaction costs on northern and Mediterranean vessels in the Western Mediterranean at the time of the northern invasion. Giving an impact assessment of transaction costs and calculating all of the merchants' costs in a market is nearly impossible, especially when relying on historical sources related to the Ancien Regime. As such, data on GA events can be used as a proxy of transaction costs, but they do not account for all transaction costs impacted merchants or ship owners' businesses. GA funding principle relates to the common proportional liability of all participants in a sea venture to contribute to the loss of one or a few of them incurred to save the vessel otherwise in distress. It is a spreading risk technique. For this reason, we could refer to GA as a form of mutual protection. As such, values in GA calculations should reflect ships and cargo's effective values, even better or more than, for example, with other quantitative sources as insurance policies. GAs was a discrete type of agreement governed by rules which were generally acknowledged and accepted across Europe, even with substantive differences in their practice. So these were the sources on which we worked. A standard average procedure consisted of a report and, eventually, of a damage apportionment calculation. The report was a transcription of the events that occurred during navigation, with information on shipmasters' routes and nationalities. The most common GA accidents were jettison, cutting of the mast, or the shallop's abandonment. If a report complied to the specific requirements stated in Genoese rules, a calculation followed. A calculation that you can see here on the right was an estimate of the value of the vessel, the cargo, and, if certain conditions were met, the freights. These values were complemented by the calculation of all damages and administrative or unforeseen expenses. The proportion between all values and the damages determined the contributing ratio that each involved party, merchants and ship owners, had to pay. As results from our dataset, northern vessels paid, on average, less than all other Mediterranean ships, as results from their higher efficiency. Plus, according to the Genoese historian Giuseppe Felloni, about 60% of large vessels arriving in Genoa in this period were involved in a GA. Therefore, the datasets we use is representative of the overall number of vessels reaching Genoa between 1590 and 1616. In addition, the application of a Svr model is particularly suitable given the close connection between transaction costs and ships' nationalities. The former are a function of the ship's quality, and in turn, the ship's quality depends, as we have seen and as stated by the literature, on their nationality. Now I leave the floor to Luigi.
Okay, sorry for this changing. Okay, in order to test the relationships between transaction costs and northern invasion phenomenon, we applied the structural vector autoregression model. We decided to adopt this kind of model for several reasons. The first one is that this kind of model is particularly suitable to model endogenous variable interactions. And the second one is that the idea behind this approach is to assume the so-called Zlasky and Frisch economy, so an economy driven by exogenous structural shocks. For this reason, this is particularly appropriate to describe the northern invasion phenomenon because they represent exogenous structural shocks on maritime trade between the late of the 16th century to the start of the 17th century. In Svr Model, these shocks are dynamically propagated through the impulse response function that are the response of economic agent. Therefore, the Svr Model is the result, the economy implied in the Svr Model is the result of these shocks plus the impulse response of the economic agents. Okay, now a little of theory to describe in the best way what is a structural regression model. So more formally, the economy represented in Svr model can be written as in equation 1, where yt is the vector of the endogenous variable, B is the matrix of coefficients, L is the lag Pareto, and mu t represent the white noise structural shocks. The white non-structural shocks in Svr model show the following property explained in equation 2 and equation 3. In equation 2, the expected value of these shocks is equal to identity matrix for I equal to J, so for contemporaneous event, while in the equation 3, the expected value of these shocks is equal to 0 for I different to J. This is mean basically equation 2 show that these shocks are uncorrelated over time. So these follow autocovariance equal to 0. In few words, the shocks at time t minus 1 does not affect the shock at time t. The second point is that these shocks are orthogonal. So the same shock at times minus 1 does not affect another shocks at times minus 1. This is an orthogonality property. So finally, the impulse response can be written as in equation 4, where B0 represents the matrix of coefficients at times t, B1L is the matrix of coefficient at times minus 1, B2L square is the matrix of coefficient at times minus 2, and so on. So if the vector of the endogenous variable is stationary, then admit a Wold representation. So Wold theorem states that each covariant stationary variables can be represented as a vector moving average. So as a time series with a stochastic component plus a deterministic component. In equation 5, we can observe that CL is the deterministic component and the epsilon t is the stochastic component. Obviously, the impulse response of C is very similar to the previous one, and the mu t follow Gaussian.
Luigi, may I say that you cannot get into these details because
okay.
you only have 5 minutes left.
Okay.
Okay.
In the final equation 11, this is the equation of the structural vector regression model, where our endogenous variable are function on previous values of our endogenous variable multiply for the structural shocks, that is the shocks at time t, so the original shock. This is in this sense, the Svr model is the results of shocks plus the impulse response function of the agents. Okay, now we estimate our Svr model. We have two endogenous variables. The first one is the average age rate, that is our proxy for transaction cost. This is measured in percentage. It is covered the period from 1519 to 1616. This follow annual frequency. This is our proxy for transaction cost. While the second one is the northern ships ratio that represents the number of northern ships to the total of ships arrived in the Genoa harbor. And this is our proxy for northern invasion phenomenon. Always this is also in percentage and cover the same time period with the same frequency. Okay, both endogenous variables are stationary. It cost both augmented Fuller test and Philip-Heron test. We choose lag order 1 for this model. We follow several information criterion to choose this perfect lag. Now, another very important point to estimate our Svr model is the identification strategy. We decided to adopt a very common approach, the Cholesky decomposition. The Cholesky states that the first shock is the only shock affecting the first variable contemporaneously, and the first and the second shock the only two affecting the second variable, and so on. In our model, this means that the average GA rate affects contemporaneously northern ship ratio, but at the same time, northern ship ratio does not affect average GA rate. Behind this assumption, there is an economic reason, because we think that a changing in the transaction cost affect immediately at the same time the behavior of northern ship master, while if there is an increase in northern ship in the Mediterranean Sea, this does not affect at the same time the GA rate, because there is need more time to adjust prices in pre-industrial world. Okay, taking in account all these assumptions, these are our results. We plotted and estimated the impulse response function. The first one shows what happens if we have shocks in northern ship ratio, and we note that with a positive shock in northern ship ratio, we have a decline in transaction cost. So this impulse response function means that if we have an increase in northern ships in the Mediterranean Sea, the average transaction cost tend to decline. And the second one show the effect of a shocks in the average GA rate, so a positive shock in transaction cost, and the response of the northern ship ratio is an increase in northern ship ratio. So this impulse means that if we have an increase in the transaction cost, northern ship come to Mediterranean to exploit their competitive advantage in transaction cost. So finally, our conclusion very quickly, the quantitative analysis confirms the relevant role played by transaction costs in the northern invasion phenomenon. The general average source is proved to be a reliable proxy of maritime shipping transaction costs, and also the adoption of structural variable regression methodology proved beneficial to study this kind of phenomenon. Okay, sorry for the long time.
No, thank you very much. Then in the end, we speed it up.
Yeah.
So someone wants to intervene? Paolo.
Thank you very much. That was a really interesting paper. The sources, they look fantastic, and a very how to say mastered way of using the source in quantitative terms. My question is more a generic one. Maybe I lost something in the presentation, but I'm not entirely convinced that this general average captures transaction cost. To me, seems to capture more, given it's a sort of insurance, more the safety of the relative safety of the relative types of ships, which is an indirect way of talking about transactional cost. But again, maybe I missed something, so you can clarify. But I think you're measuring something slightly different than transaction cost. You're measuring more the reliability, maybe, of different types of ships and different nationalities.
Yeah, sorry, I'll answer to this question. General average is quite a complex institution, so there wasn't much time to explain in details how it functions and what does it mean. It's still applied today. Even the ever given in the Suez Canal last summer did a general average, for example. A general average is a cost that each merchant and the ship owners as a group have to pay following an accident on a maritime route. So it's a transaction cost in this sense. It's an extra cost applied to the carrying of a cargo from port A to port B. And general average is constituted by value of the ship plus value of the freight plus value of the goods. In proportion with the damages, so it is in a way to obtain a contributing ratio, a contributing share, and each merchant, and the ship owners as a group pay this percentage on their own goods. So if I carry 100 lire batch of goods and there is a 10% general average, I pay 10 extra lire to refund whoever lost something during the voyage.
Someone else? Marco Martinez.
Yes, just a very quick, thank you for the presentation. Just a clarification question. You mentioned that 60% of the ships that reached Genoa were involved in a general average. Were they involved in the trip, in the journey to Genoa, or over the entire? Because maybe I didn't get this from when you described the data set. And then just another just to make sure I understood your conclusion. So you said that the northern ships that came to Europe they came to Europe to the Mediterranean to exploit their advantages in transaction costs. But so is the explanation behind relating to the fact that their boats were more equipped to sailing in the Mediterranean because of the technical features you mentioned, and this made them less prone to have shipwrecks and stuff like that? Okay, I hope I understood.
Thank you for the question. All voyages all our voyages refer to voyages headed to Genoa. So Genoa is the port of destination. And regarding your second question, yes, northern vessels have several design and labor saving techniques that allow them to ask for lower freights. That is why we find northern vessels during all the 17th century. For example, during the 40s of the 17th century, we can find northern vessels on all Mediterranean routes, except on the cabotage routes, or the short distance routes.
May I ask a question myself? But were these northern ships carrying the same type of goods as the local ones, the Mediterranean ones, or instead they were bringing commodities that were not so available, and therefore they took advantage of the diversification? You know? So this is my question.
Yeah, at first they carried mainly cereals from Northern Europe, Poland in particular, to the Mediterranean. After that, since the 1602, they start carrying for Northern Europe also furs and metals, for example, iron, or codfish and salted fish from Newfoundland, from the Atlantic. When they start operating in the Mediterranean, they replaced previous Mediterranean vessels. For example, in our period, there were Ragusan vessels from Dubrovnik, carrying cereals to Genoa. By the 1620, English vessels replaced Ragusan vessels carrying the same goods. So cereal, for example, in this case, but they also carried goods from the Eastern Mediterranean.
But the cost of the cereals was different?
Yes, the cost of the sailors and the value of the vessels, because the northern vessels were much cheaper and therefore asked for lower freights, but could carry the same amount of goods that carried, for example, Ragusan vessels. That is why they almost disappeared during the first half of the century.
Thank you very much. Roberto?
Yes, hi. A question, maybe you said it and I missed it. Do we know that northern ships use this type of sharing, this way of sharing risk equally frequently than the Mediterranean ships, or maybe they had different ways of sharing risks, and that may somehow drive your results?
No, they use the same kind of risk-sharing technique with small differences in local application. In particular, we have a lot of policies of load policies, manifesti di carico, redacted in Northern Europe, stated that in case of general average, they will follow the custom of the sea. That it means they will follow the rules in the port of destination. General average is being called, has been highlighted as one of the example of the application of a lex mercatoria, shared of common rules applied throughout Europe, although there were local differences.
Yes, I see Paolo. Do you want to come back, or?
Yeah, can I just, I think it's actually follow up on your comment there, which I found it, I think was more pointy than sounded like. In a sense that the advantages of these northern vessels can come from two ways. One is the efficiency of transportation. The other one is, of course, the types of goods that you transport. And I think it's important that you try somehow to differentiate that. Yes, as long as you deal with cereals from different sources, if the market is integrated, the price might be more or less the same, more or less. But when you start introducing different goods that simply Mediterranean ship cannot get, or only at a much higher cost, then you can have an advantage which has little to do with the techniques of navigation or the quality of the boat. And I think I think for for your results would be important that you try to differentiate that a bit more. So I think Vera's point was, I think, a bit deeper than that looked like.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, sure. It would be interesting to observe the operativity of northern and Mediterranean vessels on the same routes or in a specific type of cargo. In this case, we were limited also by our sources, since we couldn't be able to build a complete time series for the entire 17th century. Maybe we will be able to do this for the end of the 17th century. We decided to focus on the northern version because of this shock that allowed us to use the Svr model.
Okay, so thank you very much. Also, the third paper went quite well. Thank you to Antonio and Luigi, and go ahead. Okay, we move to the final paper of this morning by Battistoni and Martinez. It deals with the finances of a well-documented Greek city in the 1st century before Christ, Tauromenion, but unfortunately only saw an abstract, so I have no idea of the argument of the paper. So go ahead, so we will learn.
Okay, so thanks again for thanks also from my side for having me and my colleague Filippo Battistoni here. He will be listening and possibly answering to some questions. Okay. He's ancient historian in Pisa, and I'm a PhD student in Pisa as well. The title of this presentation is Rome and the Polis, Tradition and Change in the Financial Accounts of Tauromenion in the 1st century BC. And we think we are very happy to present it here because we think it fits well with Fenoaltea's research agenda, and also possibly, we hope, with this deep awareness of methodological problems, which are especially true and present in ancient history, as he mentioned in his last paper on the Annals on the Fondazione Luigi Einaudi. The reconstruction of the past reflects the observer's talents and experience. This is especially the case for ancient history, where the sources are scattered and the evidence is really hard to come by. We are focusing on the 1st century BC, so after a few centuries of Roman expansion over the Mediterranean and beyond, and where the cities, the states that the Roman Empire and Roman Republic met over across the expansion were mostly organized across city-states as Greek city-states, which have a long history, at least dating back to the 8th century before Christ, and they started to lose their autonomy during the period of the Roman expansion. This relation between Greek cities or Greece and Rome has been studied from many different perspectives, but in the case of medium-sized average Greek city-states, we believe that there are still some questions that might be useful to be answered. First of all, whether the Roman influence was an opportunity to economic progress or decline for city-states, and whether there could be the possibility that the expansion of Rome was actually preceded by a voluntary need by the city-states to integrate in the Roman sphere to get some benefits out of this. This is a very complex issue. We're just trying to give some first answers to this, and we do so by studying the monthly financial accounts of the city of Tauromenion, today's Taormina. And we do so by using a re-edition of inscribed material that that can be found was found across Tauromenion. There are some advantages. I will go also to the disadvantages, but there are some advantages to using these financial accounts. First of all, they are monthly, so we can look at within year and between year variation. We also get a bottom-up perspective because we see the change by observing it through the city-state itself and not by historiographic accounts of from the Roman side. And also these are exceptional because we can see a clear Roman style break in the sense that at some point we can observe a change in the Latin style. So the offices change name, they become Latin, the months are Latin, and other, if you're interested, there are also other changes. And at the same time, given that Tauromenion in many respects was not too exceptional, was a rather average city-state, we think that compared at least to other instances where epigraphic evidence is abundant, such as Delos or Athens, this can give us more valid, externally valid evidence about what happened with the Roman expansion. Just to give you a very brief historical background, Sicily became the first Roman province after the Punic War, and it was a very important provider its role was very important in the Roman economy because of the provision of corn. It also got some important privileges by Julius Caesar, such as the privilege of the Latinitas, which was maintained with Sextus Pompey, and only with Augustus, the many cities of Sicily got the status of colony, which meant that there were colonists actually settling in Sicily, so it was not a positive thing for Sicily. And we get also important institutional details from the oration of Cicero's, the Verrines, but I'm not going too much in depth here. Let's go to the data. So the accounts we have are carved on walls, possibly of public structures. So they have a very public outlook. They were really present and visible to all the citizens before, but they were probably published, written before on papyri or tablets. We have four main accounts: the civic account called Tamiai, the sacred account, the Hieromnamones, the corn account about wardens of the corn, and then deposit account, which was name also relates to the corn, so probably had to do with grain as well, or at least originally. We can observe 60 months of records within 50 not always consecutive years, so 60 out of approximately 182 months. And we observe revenues, expenditures at the monthly level, and running balances, so accumulated balance, a sort of rest of what was left in the account by the end of each month. This is an example of, I don't know if you can see it all because I have this, but okay. So this is an example of an inscription. It's a well-preserved one, and it was inscribed on limestone, which was a very popular or frequent type of rock. It's very heavy. It's about 300 kilograms, this one. And so basically, as you can see, it's divided in three, let's say, pages. So the rock was divided in three parts. And the numbers and all the information was written in extenso. So, for instance, we have highlighted this part where you cannot read it, but it's written. This is a number. It's the number 164,294 tessera and ecos and so on. So it's a number. And also, so we have the number, whether it's entry and exit and deposit, and and so it's very systematic in a sense. We have also other information from time to time, but that's the structure. That was well preserved. This one is less, as you can see. The limestone has a tendency of exfoliating, and so it's also quite difficult sometimes to interpret, and that's why we had to do another re-edition of the sources. We organized so we have more 11 sources, but we only consider we don't consider the first two, because they are really hard to decipher and not somehow different from the rest, also in terms of how the balances were computed. And then some other sources have more than 1 year. So for some, we can know that whether they were consecutive. And this instead gives you an extract of the dataset, final dataset. So for instance, we have ordered them by edition, by year, because from Fantasia Fantasia to 1999 made this chronological order of the sources which we follow. So we have the account, the balance, the revenues, the expenditures. Sometimes we have information about why they were, so the type of movement. And then, for instance, here you can see that the month name changed. In fact, this is for the Roman months, so Ionios, Latin months. And instead, these are Greek months, Artemisios, Eloreios, and so on. So by just simply plotting the data we get this picture. We can first divide the evidence into 3 periods. The first is based on the 2 inscriptions that we are not considering in our dataset because they, as I mentioned, they're very scattered. And then we have a longer period of more years, of 12 years, where we find instead movements of the Tamiai and the Hieromnamones accounts, and you can notice how correlated they are, at least sometimes they tend to move together. While instead the Cetonia and the Cetophulacus tend to be stable, and so we're not really focusing on them in our study. And then in the last period is this 2. So these 2 last final years are based on the Latin style or Roman style financial inscriptions. From this picture, we could already say something, but we believe it's too scattered to really make some statements. So we try to do our best in interpolating the data in the points that we're missing. Of course, we are not basing our conclusions on the interpolated data, but at least this gives us a smooth version of the data, and we did our best to make sure that the imputation was sound. So the gray area, shaded area, is the area over which we found some imputation value possible, and then the line in between is the mean of these 100 imputed values. Instead, the dots are the true values, the values that we observe. Here we are showing a flow measure of, so it is basically the difference between revenues and expenses, which we believe is a measure of the profits, profitability of the account in each month. And so we have the Tamiae and the Hieromnamones, the civic and the sacred accounts. So they are centered around 0, but they tend to also some negative events occurred, possibly due to some investments or other reasons. But what I want to focus on is mostly the period before and after the Roman style reforms, because I think it gives us more information about our question. And we can see that the Tamiae account experienced some losses. Actually, almost only losses in the real points dots that we observe before the institutional change. While instead in the Roman period, this is not true, and these negative losses are actually due to a very high balance in the previous period. So it should be taken with caution. But we can see somehow a financial distress before the Roman style reform. And also this is true for the Hieromnamones account, because the Hieromnamones stopped before the Roman style reform. So this is the Roman style reform occurs just after this 11th year. So from this, at least we get some sense that the city was not doing so well before the Roman style reform. And if you look at what we call the stock measures, balance, the accumulated value balance, we can instead see that, of course, okay, the values were much higher for the Tamiya account. We are including this with squares the revenues from the market. So there were occasional markets occurring at the end of the year. So we have also these additional points. In general, the city was doing well because only in two instances the balance was negative and not by much. But so if again looking at the period before and after the Roman style reform, we can see that again the balance was not very high, and so there seemed to be a sort of decreasing trend in the balance in the starting from the second year before the institutional reforms. Then, and instead in the Roman period it was either stable or increasing. We also tried to test this with some simple structural break test, and we did not find a break in the Roman style period. So this we think that this evidence, combined with the fact that we see from the inscriptions some hints of financial distress, for instance, that the Citonion, the grain deposit, included new voices saying, we have written it here, Citonion of those who had promised to spend money. So there were some signs of obligation, new types of obligations that were written in the inscriptions. But just to then discuss and conclude, we're happy to see what you think, and I think also Filippo will be. So we built a new systematic series of these economic indicators for the city of Taormenion. We found that it was generally wealthy at the time, as it was able to meet its expenditures. But we've seen some signs of financial distress. Also, well, as I mentioned, through other institutional hints that we find from the inscriptions. But we do not find any sign of boom or bust after the reform, which we would expect if the reform was more a top-down military expansion by Rome. So, of course, we cannot be we cannot say this causes this, and we don't want even to say this. But we think that this evidence suggests that it was rather a decision of Taormenion to start getting more into the Roman sphere than a decision of Rome, top-down imposition, military imperialistic decision of Rome to invade Taormenion and Sicily also in terms of institution, because the city of Taormenion was also experiencing some economic downturns at the time. So this, I hope, this helps also understanding more about the role of Rome in its expansion and its possible multifaceted way of integrating the rest of its territory to Rome. Okay, thanks for your time, and I'm looking forward to the discussion. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Very interesting and distant from what we normally concentrate about. Antonio seems to have a question. Please.
Yes, thank you. I wanted to ask, there were any specificities in Taormenian history, or do you think that the data you found could be, and the conclusion you made, could be applied to the whole Sicily? And if yes, could they also be extended to the Magna Graecia region? Question number one. Question number two, maybe you said at the beginning, and I lost this information. Do you have further years beyond the institutional change, since the cutoff is just 2 years before the Roman annexation? So maybe a longer period could allow to further observe if there were any changes in the economic development of Taormina. Thank you.
Okay. So you want to answer immediately?
Okay. Yes, I can try, and then Filippo can integrate it. Okay. Well, Tauromenion was it was a wealthy city. So it was quite wealthy, and we don't have such a rich in financial accounts for other cities. So it's also hard to say for other how generalizable it was. But in terms of, at least from the institutional viewpoint, I mentioned the Verrines by Cicero. We know that it had some privileges compared to other cities. So it didn't have to pay some additional taxes, for instance, but more, it was not really a very important privilege. It was just a matter of some. So in a sense, I think it can be at least generalized to an average city in Sicily. And about Magna Graecia, maybe I can see what Filippo thinks. Honestly, I don't know. But about the cutoff, that's very interesting. It would have been nice, of course, to have more years after the cutoff. But also, again, coming back to the background, we know that it became a colony, so in approximately 20 BC. So probably things would have changed again due to another institutional reform. So in a sense, it's also nice to have only a few years, because we are kind of sure that we're not going to, we are not confounding too many different effects. I hope I have answered.
So you mean there are not additional years of data?
I mean that we don't have any other inscription of
any
this
other
kind.
inscription, yeah. And what about the qualitative sort of description of how the city fared?
You mean from the source, or do you mean?
No. The source is obviously a highly specialized one. No, qualitative.
Yeah, like chronicles.
Data in some publications. Publication is not the word in some other inscriptions.
Okay.
Or works by somebody. No?
Yeah. We have some evidence from other sources, such as the accounts of the gymnasium, which show the expenditures of the gymnasium, and on which also Filippo has worked. From historiography, from contemporary historiography, we mostly have evidence from the Verrines, by Cicero. So he was defending this Verres, who was the governor of Sicily at the time, and so he also, in this case, took advantages of this to give a wrong grand perspective. But it's more about the whole of Sicily than about the city. So Filippo can correct me, but I think that for Tauromenion we have mostly have these two, so the gymnasium inscriptions, the financial accounts, and about qualitative testimonies, we mostly rely on the Cicero's Verrines from the time.
Filippo, you may add something.
Yes, thank you very much. Thank you, Marco, for presenting, and thanks everybody for listening to and posing questions. So to just add a few items, minor items. Yes, the qualitative data, we have no qualitative data. In a sense, we should not complain about not having qualitative data, because this is the only case, one of the few cases where we have quantitative data. I mean, I see that for us, ancient historians, it is quite exceptionally good. For you, economic historians, they are, I suppose, exceptionally fragmentary, scattered, and not very good. But I think that exactly your experience can bring something which has not been made, in fact, an economic evaluation of the data. So yes, we know that Tauromenian wine was very important, was sold. We have data about this, but we can't reconstruct a general picture. So nothing like Genoa and the ships which were so brilliantly explained to us before. And also, if you consider the sources themselves, which we presented as a matter of fact, but actually Marco said this is a reconstruction. So the series we are presenting is a reconstruction. So we propose this chronological order, which of course has clearly implication on what we say. So is there a crisis? Is there not a crisis? But so
a downturn,
yes. Well, yes, or not. But I'm quite sure it's a very plausible, and I think it's correct, but still it's an hypothesis. And yes, apropos the 2 years after the last 2 years, so to say, then we can imagine that there were more years, but not many of them. Also, because you see that, I don't know how much you are familiar with the ancient documents, but it's quite exceptional that they put, and I think you can understand that, because imagine that now somebody puts on the wall the monthly accounts. Of course, they will be very, very much longer, but even a summary, a synopsis, it's quite, it's very strange. It's very strange on a monthly basis.
Also for the time, it was strange.
Yes, it was also for the time when, of course, they used more to publish on walls and so on, but also for the time, at the time it was quite exceptional. So I think they must have been some kind of writing crazy people, or they wanted to hide something and so they put it on the wall. I don't know, then it's wild guesses. About the exceptionality, and so how further can we so how can we widen this model? Well, that's a good question, and it's a central question. I think that it can be extended, and I would say not only to regions, but especially I would reckon with the single states, so city-states, because they have this polis city-state model. So you can speak of regions, Magna Graecia, or Sicily, or Graecia, or Asia, but also single cities can be. And I think that in this sense, cities that were comparable with Taromeon could have experienced something like that. But as Marco said, what is important is that here we have the bottom-up perspective. So it's the city, and we see what the city says and not what the orator, so Cicero, or even Greek sources, but of course literary sources, how they interpret it. And here we have the raw data. Well, some raw data. Well, I hope I replied to the questions.
Yeah. Thank you very much. Yes. Anyone else? Yes. Antonio or Luigi?
Yeah. Thank you, Marco. Mine is not a question, but a suggestion, probably a wrong suggestion. I worked with ancient data in my PhD. It's very difficult to apply some econometric approach to ancient data, but I am, to be honest, I see your data probably could be useful to apply a methodological approach called difference in difference. This is a way to analyze a time series in 2 different periods. For example, pre-Rome and after Rome. Maybe not, but maybe it could be a good idea to exploit better your data.
Thank you very much. I see Paolo also.
Thank you very much, Vera. I'm absolutely fascinated when we contemporary historians, we talk about sources which are not available, are not very good. We have no idea what we're talking about. So congratulations. I think it's an amazing piece of work. I have a few questions, most of them for clarification. The first is that these are monetary values. So the first question is whether the value of the currency was somehow stable over time or might have changed something in your story. Second question is whether something else happened at the time of the romanization of the city, maybe another shock of some other kind that might again, mix up a bit things. The third question is about a point that Filippo made. The fact that this was so public, this information was so public, he argued that maybe they wanted to hide something. Maybe it's the opposite. Maybe they want to reveal something. And maybe it's evidence that the city was happy with what was going on, so much so that they put it in front of, it's just a speculation. The last point, which is the only substantial one, is that what happens when you were in a deficit? I measured, so when the situation was not good, I guess they increased taxes, that they couldn't cut services because I don't think there was much or so. Who paid these taxes? Because that, I think, is the crucial question in terms of exploitation or not. If we assume that even the situation, even if you don't have big bursts, but maybe a slightly deteriorating situation of the accounts, and the locals have to pay for that, and maybe the advantages of this unbalance go to Rome, then my evidence of the opposite.
Extremely interesting questions, but I wonder whether you can answer these questions. In any case, you can try. Maybe Marco first.
I start, Marco, and
okay, yeah. Go ahead.
Integrative. So about the currency, we wish we knew that would solve a lot of questions in ancient economic history. So actually, in this case, we cannot be sure what the currency was. I mean, we know that it's talent, but it's not the Attic talent, it's the Sicilian talent. How much was the Sicilian talent worth? That's an extremely complicated problem, starting with Aristoteles and ending, well, a couple of years ago, it was the last proposal. But I think we can think that it's more or less 1 denarius. So one drachma, depending. So, but it's huge because a talent is in Attic value currency is 6,000 drachmae. So this talent is 1 to 6,000 with respect to the Attic talent. But we can think that the currency was more or less stable. In that sense, I think we can say something. So there was a sort of stability. About the shock. In the first century, you have a lot of shocks that are in the central level. So in Rome was happening everything. You start with Marius, Silas, then comes Caesar, then comes Augustus. And in between, it's all wars that reflect, in a sense, possibly not in the direct, in the corn production of Sicily, but still how to relate with this, what side do they choose, and that can have huge consequences. So
yes, we have to be brief.
Yes, sorry. About Hyde and yes, of course, they can show something. It was monumental, it was imposing, so they wanted to show possibly that the city was going well, or possibly that the city was honestly administered. Then, if somebody read that, I don't know how much could be read. It could be, but I don't know if it was a pleasant lecture reading. About the crisis. About crisis, we know something more in the ancient world, because in crisis comes very brave individuals, and they give money to the city. That's what we call a vergetism, which is voluntary, but it's a social need. So you can't avoid to be a citizen and refuse to be an vergetes. I use the Greek word. So it's a sort of parallel. The society was quite different. It's somebody says it's the modern donor philanthropic North American system. In a sense, something like that. But no, it's really a social compulsion to provide for the city in case of need. Yes. So taxes, well, that's what we, I don't say it I shouldn't say it, Banca d'Italia, but it's about politics and raising taxes or not. They didn't do that very much. It's more voluntary, strict, compulsory contributions. I hope I've been brief.
Thank you very much. Marco, just a short... Addition?
Yes, I think on these points, I don't want to say much to the interest of time, but I want to say, try to reply to Luigi, who suggested about using a different significance approach. We thought about it, it would have been very nice, but in my opinion, it's hard because we don't have any counterfactual Taromanian or any, we just have one series, and it's already something, it's already hard to claim that the series we have
is a series.
exactly. So I think it's in this case it would be hard to defend, but in general I would agree. Yes.
Okay, I thank you all for the very creative papers that you have produced. No, really, it was a pleasure to listen to these papers. So we will meet again at 2 in the afternoon, and we will continue. Thank you very much to everybody, and have a nice lunch. Unfortunately, we cannot share it.
Thank you very much.
Everybody. So see you.
Ciao, we'll be back later.
Bye-bye.
Ciao, grazie.
Ciao.